Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm this session's host, Stephen, and welcome to the third session of JSDC. Today, in this session, we have our speaker, Henry. He's a seasoned technical lead with over 80 years of experience in building web applications. And today, Henry will bring us the big three, my real-world experience with React, Vue, and Svelte in production apps. In this talk, he will share his real-world experience using React, Vue, and Svelte in production. And let's give a warm applause to Henry.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. I think this is still morning. How are we feeling? Doing good? Okay, let's get started then. So first of all, a bit about me. My name is Henry Lee. I'm currently a technical lead at Henge. We're a company in Japan building P2P cloud security solutions. And a little bit about me. I like ergonomic keyboard, split keyboard, and I use NeoVim at work. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the frameworks itself. So here is like a rough experience that I had working with these three frameworks. All of these happens to be in the same company. So in our company, like different product teams can choose different frameworks. And I had the opportunity to use Vue, Svelte, and React, all three of them in the same company. And from what you can see, the one in the middle, Svelte, is I architected the entire project. The other two, I inherited the project. So maybe from here, you can already see my bias, like which one I like the most, but let's keep it until later. So before we start, I would like to know like my audience better. So which of the three frameworks are your favorite, or which ones are you using? Raise your hand if you're using React or you prefer React. Okay, quite a lot of people likes React. How about Vue? Not bad, not bad. How about Svelte? Oh, nice. I almost didn't expect anyone to raise hands during Svelte. So it's good that we have a good mix. So a preface, like we're not here trying to like see which one is going to beat the other, which one is going to do the best, number one, number two. What we're looking forward to see is like the trade-offs, like which one would fit better for our project. And throughout this talk, I'll give breakdowns of the three frameworks on these three parts, which I think is like the most important parts of using a web framework. I think when we talk about using a web framework as opposed to vanilla JavaScript, we're thinking of the benefits in terms of componentization, reactivity, and lifecycle. First one is the component structure, which is like from vanilla JavaScript where we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript separately. How do we combine them together to be a component that fulfills a single use? First of all, let's look at React code. I think a lot of people would be familiar with this. This is a very simple toggle component. So it includes a button that will switch the theme from dark theme to light theme. From here, we can see that React receives props. We call it props, which is like the one in the parentheses. The props is inside the curly bracket, so we have like a theme, a toggle click. Those are reactive data that is provided by the parent. And when they change, the component will be re-rendered to reflect the latest data. And the event handler is also passed in together with props. So toggle click, there is an event handler. When the button is clicked, the component will be the one who calls that function. And in React, it's also one of the unique thing is like it doesn't have like a default way to write CSS. You can basically style your component in any way you want. You can define it as an object prop, inline, in a separate CSS file, CSS in JS like style components, emotion. You can also use things like Tailwind. So there are many ways for us to style components. And the control flow statements looks like JavaScript. So you can see there like there's a ternary if. If the theme is dark, then you render the image of the dark theme. If not, you render the image of the light theme. This looks like JavaScript, which contributes to people's like more easily learn React. But it's important to know also that it's not real JavaScript, as in like, oh, if I don't like a ternary if, I want to use an if statement, because I think that's clearer. You cannot do that here, because that's a JSX syntax. that's all about React. And now let's switch to Vue. In Vue, they use like a single file component syntax. So instead of just a function that is self-contained, you have like a file that is split into three, which is like corresponds to HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So we have the script setup there, the style there, and the template here. Let's go through them one by one. So one important thing is that in Vue, you can customize the blocks to fit what you need. For example, like by default, it supports JavaScript, but you might want to use TypeScript instead. You can just say script length equal TS. That is like very similar to how HTML works. Like HTML also allows you to define a script block that allows you to have attributes. So Vue is trying to mimic that. And also styling, you can also apply the scope attribute, which means like by default, any style that you define in this file will only apply to the elements in that component. That already solves a lot of the major issues with CSS. Because usually one of our biggest issues with CSS is that scoping. Like we don't want styles from this component to affect the other component. And next one is about defining props. So this is a bit different from React. In React, it's just a function that receives a parameter. In Vue, we use like a compiler flag called define props. This is the TypeScript version, which means like you can actually define or put TypeScript types inside the generic parameter. So your props will be strictly typed by default. And for event handling, instead of receiving a handler from the parent and calling it, we also use the compiler flag called emit, which will emit an event, which is a bit similar also to how HTML vanilla JavaScript works. We just emit an event for the parent to listen to and act upon. And lastly, about the control flow statements, instead of using like a separate syntax with curly brackets, Vue decides to use directives, they call it, which is like very similar to an attribute. So for example, like in this case, we want to conditionally render the image. So what we do is we add an attribute called vif. An element or a component with a vif would listen to the condition and render based on whether or not the condition returns true. And you can use velse to render the other way around. And lastly, this is about Svelte. You can see this is very similar to Vue actually. The only difference is that the template doesn't need to be wrapped by the template element. But everything else, like at least the file structure looks similar. But there are some important differences, which is like it scopes CSS by default. It doesn't receive any scope attribute. And by default, every style block is scoped. This is very good because like sometimes in Vue, we would forget to put the scope attribute and it will accidentally leak. So the way Svelte is doing it by default, I think is really great. And then to pass in props, first the child component needs to define it. And the definition is also using a compiler flag. In this case, it's called the $props. So you can destructure all props from there and define the TypeScript type from there. The event handler part is more similar to React than Vue, which is it's also passed in as a prop, and we just call it when an element inside our component wants to emit an event. And lastly, for the condition, it's a very custom syntax. It's not JavaScript. If you have experience with like templating languages like EJS or handlebars, this might look a bit familiar, or PHP maybe even. So you would put like inline logic blocks to define how to write. And by the way, I think that's wrong, sorry. It doesn't use vif or velse. So it just uses the curly brackets. So that are about component structure, how we write components. Next, let's talk about reactivity, how they update the UI based on the data changes. First of all, React is something like this. This is a simple example of an app that has a state and a multiplier, a value, a number value, multiplier, and it will also print the value multiplied by the multiplier. It's a very simple component, but this is like more to show how to build like a rather complex component and how we use each of the building blocks. First of all, with React, we use something called useState, which is a hook that will return a tuple of getter and setter. React values immutability, so they don't want us to just randomly change the value of a variable. So if we want to read the value, we use the getter, which is the left part, and we use the set, which is the right part, to alter the value of the state. For side effects, so if we want to do something after the state has changed, we use what we call a use effect. And this listens to the dependency array, which is on the bottom there. It listens to the state called count, which means that every time count changes, and every time the component is rendered the first time, you would rerun this block. And in React, you also need to do performance optimizations because of the way it renders components again and again. You have to find which calculations are expensive that you don't need to do over and over again, so you can memoize the result. And this is from a hook called useMemo. In this case, for example, like if we know that anything else other than the count and multiplier changes, you don't need to recalculate the value. You can just keep the old value. But only if those two changes, you would want to recalculate this. So this helps on saving from having too many re-renders. Next part is about view. This look quite different from React, and let's go through them one by one. The first one, the state. In Vue, there are two ways to define state. Although here I only use one, which is like ref. Ref is for defining primitives like string, number, or they also have reactive to define an object. But one thing to note is that with ref, they're wrapping the value, the primitive value in an object. So if you want to access them, you have to call ref.value. So count.value equals something, or you can set also set count.value directly. But with reactive, you don't have to do that. And next one about side effects. In Vue, there are two types of side effects, unlike with React. The first one is computed, which is basically anytime any variable inside of it changes. For example, here, Vue would know that count and multiplier are states, which is defined by refs. So it will automatically decide, oh, if count or multiplier change, I would recalculate this value. Otherwise, I won't recalculate it. And this is happening by default automatically, unlike with React where you have to define the dependency array. And lastly, there is a watch or watch effect, which is a bit similar to React's effect. The difference is that, so React's effect is more similar to watch, where you have to pass in the dependency array manually. But with watch effect, it's all automatic, similar to the computed above. It will see which reactive values have changed and only run when those values change. Lastly, this is about Svelte. This looks a bit simpler already. Let's go through them one by one. The first one is state. So we have the compiler flag called $state. This looks like a function, but this is actually part of the language. So you don't have to import it anywhere. You can just define that this is a state. I have two states, one called count with the default value of 0. The second one is called multiplier with the default value of 2. And it also have two kinds of side effects, which is very similar to Vue. Vue's computed would map to Svelte's derive. And Vue's watch effect would map to Svelte's effect. It doesn't have the manual version where you have to put the dependency array manually. Svelte wants to automate this kind of things for you as much as possible. Third part is about the lifecycle. So lifecycle is about how to detect changes and update the UI, how to prevent us from having to re-render the UI too often. And here, each framework also does things quite differently. First of all, lifecycle in React. You might have heard people say that React is not reactive, which is actually interesting. Some people say like React is the wrong name for this framework actually. And the reason they say that is because React component declaration, the part that you see in the function before, is actually a render function, which means that every time React wants to re-render a component, they will call that function again and again. And then also when the state changes or the prop that is passed from the parent changes, they will also re-render the function again. And React uses virtual DOM diffing, which means it will, like batch changes, it will store the planned changes in a virtual DOM. And eventually, when it's time to update the DOM, they would compare the virtual DOM with the real DOM and only make changes in the parts that is necessary. And in React, re-render happens in the entire component scope. So the bigger your component is, like the bigger the area that you need to re-render. Then there might be a question then. If React is a render function, how can the hook, like useState, retain the value if it's rerun every time? Because basically on re-render, we're calling the React component function again and again, right? So how does they store the state? Does anybody know? Please.
There is a linked list, right?
A linked list?
I remember they removed it in track 9.
Oh, you mean with the compiler?
Yeah.
Okay. I think with compiler, I heard that they are trying to automate memoization, like you don't need to use memo anymore. But here, I'm referring to like how the useState hook actually retains the state, and every time it renders, it won't call the function again, because the hook is like a function, right? But it's not actually calling the function again. It's basically using the value that is already stored on the first render. And the answer is that basically hooks are not just plain function calls. It looks like a function, but what it does, it's setting up side effects. So when you call a useState hook, React remembers that, oh, this is a state, so I need to cache this value between re-renders. And then on the subsequent re-renders, instead of the initial render, it will try to read from that cache. And every time we call the set state, we would also update that cache. So it retains like a cache separate from the component re-render itself. And this is why in React, when you call hooks like useState, useEffect, it has to be on the top level of the component. You cannot put it inside a condition like if, because React needs to know this and needs to optimize this. And next one about Vue. Vue uses what it called the proxy-based reactivity. So the Vue component declaration is not a render function, but it is a setup function. So you know from the beginning that it's only going to be run once. And then when you define ref, reactive, computed, it's like Vue's way of, it's like we're telling Vue that, oh, this is the state, this is the computed. And Vue will actually remember that and update automatically. Every time the state or prop changes, it will do fine-grained updates, which means like it's not going to render the entire component, but it will parse your template and we'll see if you need to update anything. So for example, if you have like 3 components in one component, and you only need, when Vue reads your state, it knows that it only needs to update 1 of the 3. It won't re-render the other 2. So the update will be more performant. And Svelte is doing the compiler way, which is like statically analyzing the code even further. So it tries to do most of the work during compilation. It parses the Svelte code, generates a highly optimized vanilla JS code, and it doesn't use vDOM at all, virtual DOM, to do the diffing. Because the compiler knows exactly how your code is structured, it knows when to do the updates. So it's also fine-grained, but you don't need to do a lot of the calculation during runtime, because it can all be done when you build the component. So this is like a breakdown of the 3 frameworks. Technically, React is a bit harder to use and optimize because first, the re-render happens on the component scope, and you need to do a lot of like manual optimizations. Vue and Svelte uses similar concepts, which like prevents many of React's drawbacks. But for now, Svelte is the lightest and the most performance because they're using compiler, but the competitions are catching up. So React is planning to do React compiler, which will mean you won't need to use memo or use callback anymore. They will also do the compiler approach where it knows which part of the code needs the dependency array for use effect and do it for you automatically. So you don't need to do that anymore. Vue is also doing similar with Vue Vapor, which is like a compiler for Vue. And it's also planning to integrate like much more performant alien signals, which they say will make Vue the fastest framework out of all the currently existing frameworks. So that is very cool. But those are all technical comparisons breakdown. What about in real world? How do these translate to real world benefits? First of all, learning curve. With React, what we find most often when development, like from our developers, is like the struggle. Like, why does this re-render? Like, the component is so big, I'm not sure which part actually causes this component to re-render. And what is the use effects dependency array? Like, you can set a linter that always tell you to set any state into the dependency array, but you actually sometimes want to exclude some of them, but the linter doesn't allow you to. So you need to exclude the linter. You need to tell the linter, this is fine, I don't need to override it. So it's like you constantly need to understand the framework better and better. But as you actually understand it more, the mental model clicks. It's like a one-way data flow. It prefers immutability. And it feels very powerful to be able to master React and start using it more smoothly. With Vue, coming from React, you would feel like, oh, this is much simpler. Like the template, the script tag feels very familiar, especially if you've written HTML, CSS, JS before using React. Like you will feel like, oh, this is like writing normal HTML, CSS, JS. But then Vue has some confusing points too. Like, why do I need to use dot value, which is referring to like refs values, but not everywhere else? Like reactive doesn't need dot value. You might forget to actually use dot value and accidentally refer to the proxy instead of the actual value of the ref. And Vue also gone through like a major update from Vue 2 to Vue 3. They have like the old options API syntax versus the new composition API syntax. Those also like make it pretty confusing sometimes, especially when you are inheriting a legacy code and you want to renew them. You have to constantly look into both the old documentation and the new one. With Svelte, it feels much simpler. So Svelte has a lot of the same benefits as Vue, but it's like doing it in a much simpler way. It reduces all the complexity. Like you don't have to think about using ref versus reactive or watch versus watch effect. Like you only have one way to do things, and Svelte just automatically manage everything for you. So the learning curve is also very small, cause like the compiler is much smarter, at least at this moment, but the competitors are also catching up. Next one is about the readability. In React, like you have to really, when you look into the component, you have to understand like how the state is going to be used here, how is it going to affect re-render, and when you need to optimize the performance. Like you have to really go into like the stream of the logic's code and really understand what it's doing. And because of React's way of re-rendering the entire component, like you might have some optimizations that you need to make. Like for example, you need to split a big component into smaller components so that they re-render separately and you can memoize different parts. This also like it also has its own good thing, but sometimes you might feel like this actually doesn't need to be split into another component, but I have to do it because that's what React wants me to do to make it performant. With Vue, it feels like reading a very well-organized document. There is a script tag, template tag, style tag. In one file, you can clearly see what is doing what. Unlike with React, where you can have JSX anywhere. Like you can pass JSX as a prop, or you can return it from a component function. So this makes it very easy for developers, for new developers to come in and start contributing quickly. With Svelte, it feels like even simpler than Vue. It reduces the complexity between like the different options, like ref and reactive. And next one, let's talk about the complexity. So with React, one thing that you need to think about the most is performance. Like maybe if the component is fast enough, you don't care about it. But once you think something is slow, then okay, I need to think about optimizing. Do I need to use memo here? Or do I need to wrap the entire component in a memo? Or should I use a use callback to pass in this function so that it's cached between re-renders? Like this kind of things like adds to the mental load in writing React. And also with React, there is no opinionated styling, which means like different teams can have different ways of styling components. Like in our company, some teams use Tailwind, some teams use styled components. So there is no standard way to do it, which means like it's also harder to share knowledge and maybe like to have people from one project help in the other project. With Vue, like compared to React, it's like handling most of the complexity for you. You don't need to optimize anything because like it knows what to optimize and optimize it for you. But also in Vue, like as mentioned before, like the small things like reactive versus ref can introduce a small amount of complexity. And with Svelte, like those kind of small inconsistencies are not existent. So the mental overload is the lowest here. And yeah. And also compared to React, like Vue and Svelte allows you to mutate state directly. Instead of having to use getter and setter, you can actually do count plus plus, for example, to add 1 to the count number variable. So it's like much more like using vanilla JavaScript. And lastly, community. So with React, it feels like you come into a huge community. Like everyone makes libraries about React. You can find like maybe 10 different component libraries. You can find like 5 different ways to submit forms. There are a lot of options, but also like it could be hard to decide which one to choose. Usually we would go with the most popular. With Vue, there's like a good balance between community and also like first party and third party. They have their own things, and the third party libraries are growing and growing. And you can still very easily find answers online if you have an issue. With Svelte, the community is much smaller. So there are some people who really know it, but you don't get as many component libraries or forums when you can ask people about your problems. And lastly, about recruiting, with React, you can find many React engineers everywhere. So it's very easy to find developers. But on the other hand, it could be harder to find good developers, as in like people who actually understands React and can help you debug React issues. It can be harder to find. With Vue, the market side is like in the middle between React and Svelte. It's like solid. You can, if you learn Vue, you can quite easily get a job, especially in Asia, I feel. And also the framework itself is less complex, so it's much easier to get like good engineers. With Svelte, the talent pool is much, much smaller. I think it's very rare to be able to find a job in Svelte right now. But also like the learning curve is gentle. So even if you have like an intern or a newcomer to the company, they can get producing very quickly. So when to use each framework? You can choose React when your project requires a robust ecosystem and a broad talent pool. You want to hire more people and you need a long-term stability. React has been around for more than 10 years. And you can very easily find any component library or any library to help you moving very quickly. With Vue, you might want a better balance between convenience and also the flexibility. Vue has like the middle ground between the popularity and also the ease of use compared to React. And with Svelte, since it's much more performant, but you don't have a big community, you might think like, oh, I might try it if I'm trying to build a very new project, or it's like a small-ish project where I won't need to find a lot of like third-party stuff. So the conclusion is that the best framework is the one that fits your team and fills your team with confidence and joy. But also, by the way, try Svelte if you have not. It's actually a very cool framework, and not many people are trying it yet. And lastly, before I close, this is a bit about my company. So my company, Henge, is like building P2P SaaS cloud security solutions. They're sponsoring me to be able to come here. And we sometimes open like full-time and internship positions in Japan. So with the internship, like you can get like 6 or 8 weeks of your accommodation covered to come to Japan and have an internship. So please have a look if you're interested. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much. These are my socials if you want to connect. Thank you.